Hi guys, Orlando Morgado here. I'm going to show you guys how to mix alginate and make a mold and take a casting from that alginate mold with plaster. So first things first, safety issues. You want to make sure that when you're dealing with plaster and alginate, you're using the alginate as your mold making material, especially when you're dealing with a project like this where we're casting a part of our body. In this case, we're going to be casting a finger. For something like this, you don't want to mix a bucket of plaster and stick your hand or any part of your body in a bucket of plaster and wait for it to set. It's very dangerous. You can physically get stuck in it, and more importantly, when plaster cures, it undergoes an exothermic reaction and it becomes extremely hot. So you want to make sure that you do not have your skin in contact with that material when it is cured. So we're going to be making our mold out of alginate. So we've got a couple of things here. Here is your alginate. Here is some water. Those are our primary ingredients. We also have our safety equipment here. We've got splash goggles, which you guys have all received. We've got a big old pack of nitrile gloves, which you guys have also received. Watch, it's gonna have to come off. And I'm working on top of one of the boards here in the shop. When you guys do this, you guys received a roll of plastic sheeting or a pack of plastic sheeting. You're gonna wanna use the plastic sheeting to make sure that you protect wherever you're working, because this stuff is messy, it gets on everything, and it's not particularly easy to clean up. You'll also notice that I'm wearing this lab coat. I don't just normally wear lab coats, so this is also to protect my clothing. So those are the basics, and we will start working with this stuff. All right, so we got our safety gear, splash goggles, gloves, lab coat. So we're gonna be doing a finger casting, and you guys are gonna have a limited quantity of materials. You guys have a small bag of plaster. You guys will probably have a small pack of alginate. So the first thing that you wanna keep in mind is that if you are trying to cast something, you should try to waste as little material as possible. So if I'm gonna do a finger casting, I'm not gonna wanna get a bucket like this. I'm gonna wanna get something like this. So that's number one. The other issue is there is kind of, on the other end of things, you could make the mold too small. Alginate is going to cure flexible, and if there's not enough of the alginate there when it does cure, you're not gonna necessarily, the mold is gonna just be floppy and you're not gonna be able to use it. So, you know, you could say try to do a finger casting with something like this, but I prefer to have just a little bit more support for the alginate itself, so I'm going to use that. So when you're doing alginate or plaster, there's this idea of the temperature of the water affecting the cure time. That's true for both plaster and alginate. The warmer the water, the faster the curing process is going to be. So when you're working with alginate, the same thing holds true. You want to make sure that you're using water that's about room temperature is probably a good sort of average between too fast and too slow. The faster you want it to cure, you're going to want to use hotter water, and the slower you want it to cure, you want to use colder. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pour some water into my mixing cup. You'll notice too, I'm not going to talk about mold release with this because alginate is very wet, and it's, you know, it's literally made of algae. That's why it's called alginate. You don't really need to worry about the alginate sticking to the mold per se, or to your skin. So you could basically just mix your alginate and then put your hand straight in. So we're gonna start sifting through some of the alginate and putting it in a little bit at a time, and then mixing it. You can mix by hand, or you can use some kind of a device. And add a few handfuls Now, alginate, unlike plaster, when you mix plaster, plaster tends to cure very smoothly. Like as you mix it, you turn up with a very smooth consistency that's kind of akin to heavy cream. With alginate, you're gonna end up with something different. It's gonna kind of be gloppy like oatmeal. So you're gonna want to mix pretty thoroughly, but you don't need to worry too much about lumps and things like that like you do with plaster, because the alginate is just gonna kind of end up with a lumpy consistency. So you're gonna end up with something like that. And you'll notice that it's pretty gloopy. So once you have it mixed, then you can go ahead and get ready to do your casting. Now, you don't need mold release, but a good recommendation is to wet the surface of the skin that's going in. So I'm just gonna do a thumb. So I'm just gonna wet my thumb before I put it in, because that can help get rid of air bubbles. The other thing you wanna do is you want to agitate the mold. So you wanna tap the sides of it to get any air bubbles to rise out. And then you're basically just gonna sit here and do this for a while until the alginate cures. And again, depending on your water temperature, this could be, you know, a minute or two, or it could be 5 minutes or so. The other thing you want to keep in mind while you're doing this is you shouldn't be able to feel the sides of your mold with your hand when it's in the bucket. If you can feel the sides, like if you're touching the sides of the bucket or, you know, the sides of the cup, that's going to be a really, really thin spot on your mold, and that's going to be less than ideal for casting. Okay, so several minutes have elapsed since I poured this mold, and the alginate has pretty much solidified. So now I can start getting my thumb out of the mold. Once I start moving my hand around, I'll be able to start to feel that the mold is separating from my skin. Now, be careful about demolding. Don't just rip your hand out, because you can tear the mold, especially if you're kind of in like the gray area between I waited long enough and maybe I didn't quite wait long enough, where theoretically you could get your hand out of the mold, but if you're not delicate about it, it's going to basically just tear out. So I'm just gonna move my finger around a little bit at a time and just gradually, very carefully pull my finger out of the mold. So this is what you're gonna turn up with. It's just a solid mold, and you can see kind of the shape. It takes a rather fine casting, so you'll get, you know, fingerprints and all of the fine detail in the skin, etc. So there's the mold. And what we're gonna do next is we're gonna pour plaster in it. So when we're making that decision, when we're making the decision about pouring plaster, there's a couple of things that you can tell right away. Like, one is that there's kind of like a lip here that's really, really fine. And that might be something I'm either gonna wanna, I mean, it's not gonna cast well basically, so I'm gonna kind of wanna get rid of that. So I'm gonna take a utility blade and I'm gonna carefully remove that. The other thing is that you'll notice that there's about an inch between the end of the alginate and the top of this cup. I did that on purpose because I want to leave room for when I pour plaster in here that I can cast the digit, but also create a base. Because when I pour the plaster in it, you know, this whole space can also be filled with plaster. And when I demold it, whatever plaster is here is just going to cure into a solid sort of base. So we're going to go ahead and start working on that. So it's going to cut pretty easily. You can just use an X-Acto knife and get in there and just start carefully removing some material. Got it about as good as I think I need it to be for what I'm doing. One more thing that you'll notice is that the inside of the mold has little holes in it. Those are air bubbles from when I agitated the mold. So whatever's going to be visible on the surface of your alginate is going to turn up being cast in reverse into your plaster. So obviously the hole where my thumb was is going to be a thumb casting, and all of those little holes from the bubbles, those are going to be little sort of domes or little protrusions that are going to stick off. So that's going to be something that you're going to want to be able to either just live with it or do it on purpose and, you know, have that be part of the piece, or then you can go through the process of sanding it off, cutting it off, etc. So next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to mix some plaster. You might not know exactly how much to use. An easy way to figure it out is if you have a spare container, you can take your mold and just pour some water into it to the height that you're going to be filling the mold with plaster. In my case, it's going to be pretty much to the top, as close as I can get it, more or less. Maybe a little less than that, just so it doesn't spill everywhere. Then you can take that, pour it into a spare receptacle, and that's going to let you know how much mixed plaster you're going to need when you do your casting. Now, this is going to be too much water for my plaster. This represents the combination of plaster and water, but since it's a small quantity, I may use this. If you're trying to really conserve your material, you're going to want to dump out roughly half of this, and then you're going to be adding water into it. So I'm just going to use what I have here for the moment, and I'm going to start scooping in some dry plaster. I'm going to do 2 scoops first, and I'm going to start using my mixing stick, and I'm waiting until there's enough plaster in the water that when I withdraw my mixing tools or my hands from the plaster, I'm going to end up with a solid white coating, which basically means that the plaster has saturated the water. So we're just about there. Mix with a little extra care for casting, because you want to make sure that there's no lumps in it. Another way to deal with that is you can prevent that from happening by how you pour. Because you can just pour at an angle so that you keep any of your lumps in your mixing container. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to start pouring into the mold. Now, something that the pose of your finger can cause is there can be areas that are going to be voids in the casting. So I put my thumb kind of straight down like that. It's kind of off at an angle. So when I pour in, I'm going to kind of try to pour in at an angle so that it fills all the way down. Now, if I had done something where I posed with a finger that curves in and then curves back up, you have to worry about what's going to happen when you pour plaster in there. The plaster is going to pour and settle at the lowest point of the mold. If you have a low point at your knuckle, but then your finger curves back up, you may have trouble getting plaster to fill into this point. You might end up with an air bubble. The way you prevent that is by moving your mold around and overfilling it a little bit. But the ideal thing to do is to just not use a pose that has the potential to trap air in it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pour at an angle, little by little, to make sure it fills up. And then we're going to set it down somewhere where we can comfortably leave this for ideally overnight. And we're going to start to tap the outsides of our cup, our mold. And this is to get air bubbles to rise. And you will notice that you're going to see air bubbles that are going to appear on the surface of the plaster, and many of them are probably going to pop, some of them may not. On a small mold like this, you don't need to do it too long. On a bigger mold, you're going to want to spend some time doing this. Okay, so that's good enough. And now I'm going to let that sit, ideally overnight. at least a good few hours before you try to demold it. All right, we have let time elapse and we're gonna go ahead and start demolding this. So we have plaster in here and it goes down almost an inch on the side. And then we've got alginate. The alginate mold, when you demold alginate, it's what's called the waste mold, which means we're gonna destroy the mold. So one thing we could do is we could start to remove the cup itself, which is probably the best option. Now you have to be extremely delicate about demolding because your plaster, especially if you don't wait overnight, your plaster is gonna be, even when it's cured, it's gonna be very, very wet. So how do you know if it's cured? First of all, you're gonna see that it's gonna be solid. It's, you know, it's still soft. You could scratch it with your fingernail and get texture on it. But it's going to be room temperature or cooler. If you touch the plaster and it's still hot, it hasn't cured yet. So if it's still hot, you're not gonna wanna demold at that point because it's gonna break when you demold it. So now that this is room temperature, I can demold it, but I have to still be careful because this is wet plaster, very recently cast against wet alginate. It's all gonna be very soft. So I have to be very delicate about this process. The other thing is that I could cut this cup down the side and start to demold, which is what I'm gonna do, but I have to be careful about when I start the cut, cutting through the cup and into the plaster itself because that's going to leave a mark, which not the end of the world if I do that because I can remove the marks later by sanding or carving into the plaster. So I'm going to delicately start to cut and I'm going to start to remove the cup. Okay, so now I've got this wacky sort of jello mold thing going on. So what I don't want to do at this point is just try to break these two things apart. Ideally, what you're going to want to do is, using a similar tool, start to carefully cut chunks out. And don't cut in too deep. At this point, we're trying to find where our plaster is. Take your time and be careful not to put an excessive amount of force onto the plaster. Keep your pose in mind, and as you start to cut, you can try to start to get a picture of where things are in here, and just go a little bit at a time. I know it's very exciting. Demolding, you just want to get it out. You know, this need to sort of quickly dig your piece out of the mold is quite irresistible, but you must restrain yourself so that you do not break your casting, especially since you're casting fingers. They are inherently spindly castings that you end up with and prone to breakage. So I'm going to keep cutting away a little bit at a time, and as soon as I feel resistance, I stop cutting because I'm assuming that if I'm feeling resistance, it's because it's plaster that I'm touching. So that also means that if I have felt resistance, I have already made contact with the plaster with my X-Acto, and that could be something that I'm going to regret because it's just going to be more work to then go in and remove the marks that I've now made on the plaster. So again, small pieces that are easy to remove so that I'm minimizing how much force I have to use against the plaster itself. So now I'm starting to get a relatively good idea of where things are. And whenever I feel like it's going to be too much force that I'm going to need to exert, I'm going to go ahead and cut rather than pull. Okay. So there's the thumbs up. And that's pretty much what you're going to get if you take your time demolding. Now, this thing is still super soft, so I'm going to leave this sitting somewhere another day or so, let it really dry out. When plaster casts, it's going to, first it's going to be wet and it's going to be soft. So if you need to carve anything, like for example, along this base, if I decided there was anything I wanted to change, if I wanted to carve into this, smooth it out, get rid of any material, now is a perfect time right out of the mold. Obviously, you have to be careful with the thumb casting itself so you don't break it. But it's a really good time to make changes to the plaster because it's so soft. But if I'm happy with it, or whenever I get to that point, I've done those final sort of edits to the plaster, I'm gonna wanna take that, sit it somewhere. If you have a radiator or a heat source that is just an ambient heat source, or put it out in the sun, let it sit and let it dry out. Plaster will cure and continue curing. So this is set plaster. It goes through the exothermic reaction while it's setting, and then it's gonna cure. As it cures, it's going to release more water, it's going to get lighter, and it's going to get harder. So as it gets lighter, its tensile strength increases, and it just becomes a harder material, harder to carve, but more stable material overall. So if you basically just leave this thing and you let it sit for a couple of days, especially somewhere that's hot and dry, it's going to be a lot more sturdy. So there's your plaster casting in Alginate. Hope everybody had fun.